Good afternoon, and welcome to our Norwich University Bicentennial Celebration in the capital city. Our Vermont State House celebration has been 200 years in the making, and we're thrilled to be marking this occasion with our fellow Vermont citizens and Governor Scott. Thanks for having us, Governor. I'm Doug McCracken, Norwich class of 1970. As chair of Norwich's Bicentennial Commemoration Committee, I'm honored to be here today with you. This is one of many events in our year-long schedule of celebrations that will span the nation and the globe. You don't turn 200 every day, obviously, or every year, so we're really pleased to celebrate our history and our success. I'd like to publicly acknowledge and extend our thanks to those community members who are supporting our celebration. We are very excited to be in Montpelier today, and I think you know there are many activities and events and things going on in Montpelier itself. To our central Vermont neighbors, you'll want to mark your calendar for September 18th and through the 22nd, when thousands of Norwich alumni will be returning to Northfield for homecoming weekend and our 200th birthday party. It should be quite an event. Norwich has stayed true to its founder's vision of educating and preparing students to become American citizen soldiers and future leaders in service to our nation and others. In my role, I've relished learning about Norwich men and women who have forged our nation's history in many fields, from the battlefields to the boardrooms to the classrooms and in many other endeavors. And I might add, many serving Vermont in this historic State House and in the Congress of the United States. The Sullivan Museum and History Center exhibit and this book Citizens and Soldiers, the First 200 Years of Norwich University, tell the story of those who not only expected challenge but embraced it and achieved distinction through exemplary leadership and innovation. The author of our book, New York Times best-selling author Alex Kershaw, will be giving a presentation this afternoon at 4 p.m. in room 11. Please join us. We look forward to sharing Norwich University's remarkable story with you throughout today's events. In many ways, this is not only the story of Norwich University, but it is also a Vermont story. Thank you. Now it's my privilege to introduce to you our 23rd president and longest-serving president of Norwich University, Dr. Richard Schneider. During his tenure, he's transformed Norwich into a modern international university. He's a great leader. He is not only dedicated to the success and well-being of Norwich, but also shares that same dedication and passion to our home, the state of Vermont. President Schneider. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here in the Capitol, and especially in the Cedar Creek room where so many Norwich guys fought, as we heard from Howard Coffin earlier today. So, happy birthday, everyone. This is our 200th birthday, and a very, very special occasion here. And Governor, I want to say thank you for opening up the State House to us, and we are everywhere in the building. So, since launching our countdown to the Bicentennial, and we've actually been doing this for 5 years now, each year has had a different theme, we have been paying tribute to everything we treasure and hold sacred about Norwich. Certainly our founder, Captain Partridge, our history, our vision, our mission, and our values, especially our values, and our 200-year legacy of service, leadership, and excellence. These are the things that, these words are replete in our DNA. It's just part of Norwich, the fabric of the place. It's fitting that we reflect on our history, both in some of it inspiring and some of it tragic, and commemorate and memorialize our story as a historic opportunity to highlight progress and national prominence in leadership, innovation, creativity, and service. I've often said that what distinguishes Norwich from other colleges and universities are its people. In the end, it's all about the people. The achievements and contributions made by our students, our faculty, staff, and especially our alumni have defined what Norwich is. Norwich people are hardworking, upstanding, loyal, honest. They get stuff done. They can execute, they can build, they can fix things that are broken. They are committed to excellence in everything they do and in every transaction that they have. They are leaders of character, individuals who are not afraid to step up and do whatever it takes to accomplish the mission. When in charge, be in charge, for God's sakes. That's what Norwich people do. They step up and they do the right thing, whether people are watching or not watching. We owe much to the generations of Norwich leaders who shared our vision of our founder, Captain Alden Partridge. Norwich's bicentennial is more than just this bright spot in our history, this special day of 200 years. It's an opportunity to make our university's next 100 years even more greater, more important, more impactful than the first 200 years. It's to fulfill our legacy of making the world and the state of Vermont a better place for all future generations everywhere. A very, very special place in the landscape of American higher education and in the landscape of Vermont and in the landscape of America. So we always end our sayings with Norwich Forever, and I'm going to do that in a minute, but not yet. But this is a photo op. I'd like to have the book, if I might. The book that Doug had. Oh, there we go. This is the photo op. Governor, if you would come front and center, please. So this book that Doug McCracken worked so hard on with Alex Kershaw is entitled Citizen Soldiers, and that's what we do. We make citizen soldiers. Citizens part-time and soldiers part-time. But we are here for the Union, just as those kids were at Cedar Creek, to preserve it, protect it, to build it. That's what Norwich guys do. So I hope you enjoy this book, Governor. Let's give the Governor a big round of applause.
Well, thank you very much, President Schneider. It's great to see all of you here today. I came in this morning, saw a lot of banners, saw a lot of Norwich grads and a lot of faculty and so forth, and I thought it was a coup. But that may be a good thing. You know, you get things done, you accomplish things. We do. Yeah. I want to congratulate President Schneider, Doug McCracken, who owns a home in Rochester, as I understand, the entire Bicentennial Committee, and all the Norwich University students, staff, and alumni for what is sure to be a year of celebration and reflection on the history of the country's oldest private military college. Since its founding in 1819, Norwich has earned a distinguished record in academics, athletics, philanthropy, and much, much more. I could probably keep you here all night, all day, listing all of the achievements of Norwich University. Its merger with Vermont College, opening the campus to women and civilians, or the addition of the Peace Corps program in 1987, becoming the first of its kind in the nation. And of course, the 6 combined national championship titles by the men's and women's hockey team over the last 20 years. And the possibility of number 7 this year. Fingers crossed on that one. The Norwich ice hockey program has become the gold standard and perennial contender in D3 hockey. But what really makes this day so special is all of you who've gathered today to honor Norwich University Day at the State House, because each of you, in some way, whether you're a current student, alumni, or administrator have contributed your own piece of history over the last 200 years. For me, I've always admired those who are part of Norwich. When it comes down to what's really so special about the university, it's about who they are. It's their core mission that was mentioned. You know, I keep a copy of their statement of guiding values as well as their mission statement on my desk. And I look at that almost every single day because it's appropriate. So their mission statement, and I'm going to read it because I think it's appropriate. To give our youth an education that shall be American in character, to enable them to act as well as to think, to execute as well as to conceive, to tolerate all opinions when reason is left free to combat them, to make moral, patriotic, efficient, and useful citizens, and to qualify them for all those high responsibilities resting upon a citizen of this free republic. This was first published in 1843. And with all the polarization we're seeing throughout our country today, it's more important than ever to reflect upon this mission. These are values I believe we all can and should get behind. So thank you for promoting that and keeping that alive here in our country and in this state. So again, I thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day as well as the rest of the year in this 200th celebration. And with that, I'm going to sign this proclamation, which is going to declare something official as Norwich University Day in Vermont. So given under my hand and the Great Seal of the State of Vermont on this 20th day of February of 2019, I'll sign this proclamation. Congratulations.
Can I give you a bicentennial coin? This is a bicentennial one, not my personal. Norwich forever!
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I would start my talk, as I usually do, with the words, desperate times require desperate measures. And at the start of the Civil War, the governor of Vermont, Erastus Fairbanks, got a telegram from Abraham Lincoln, we think, asking what could be expected of Vermont in the beginning conflict. And the governor replied to Abraham Lincoln, we think, Vermont will do its full duty. Now, one of the first men to offer his services to the Union cause was Alonzo Jackman of Norwich University. And Fairbanks surprisingly told Jackson, we don't want you to go off. We want you to stay here in the state and help us prepare our local companies, our local regiments for war. Well, it's a good thing that Jackman heeded his request, because one of the products of Vermont's preparations was the 1st Vermont Brigade, which I have long contended was the best fighting unit in the Civil War. And now I think most major historians, including my friend Jim McPherson, agree the 1st Vermont Brigade was best. It was the only brigade. Now, a brigade, incidentally, is usually made up of 5 regiments, and a full-strength regiment has 1,000 men each, so you're looking at a 5,000-man fighting unit, although as the war progressed, those numbers shrunk pretty quick. Wounds, deaths, illnesses, and so forth. The 1st Vermont Brigade, which is featured in this wonderful painting, was the only brigade in the Union armies made up entirely of men from one state that served throughout the war. Why was that? Because that man right there, no, excuse me, over there in the corner, there he is over there in the corner, William Farrar Smith, better known as Baldy Smith, St. Albans native, at the beginning of the war, was a good friend of George Brinton McClellan, the first commander of the Army of the Potomac. They had both been engineers in the pre-war Army. They had worked on a project in Chicago in 1859, gotten to be good friends, and so Baldy Smith asked McClellan if he could make up a brigade of men from one state, and he got special permission to do that. Why not do it throughout the Army? The federal government was worried that if an all-state brigade got wiped out or nearly destroyed in one battle, that state might pick up its marbles and go home. So anyway, we got the 1st Vermont Brigade out of that. Well, the 1st Vermont Brigade distinguishes itself from early in the war. At Lee's Mills, at 2nd Fredericksburg, magnificent service. Of course, at Gettysburg, we win the Battle of Gettysburg. The 2nd Vermont Brigade, 9-month soldiers, attacks the flank of the most important attack of the Civil War, Pickett's Charge, and destroys it. We now know that on the 2nd day, the Vermont sharpshooters were key to the Union Army being able to hold on to Little Round Top at the southern end of the Union line, hold on to it until the 20th Maine could get possession of it and become famous. But it's the Vermonters, probably more than any other state, that win the Battle of Gettysburg, the most important battle of the Civil War. But here we are at Cedar Creek. And that's my task here, is to tell you about the Battle of Cedar Creek and the Norwich connection. Now let me first say that there's a heavy influence of Norwich people in the 1st Vermont Brigade. Charles Stoughton commands a regiment. Thomas Seaver commands a regiment in the brigade. George Foster commands a regiment in the brigade. And by the time the armies reach Cedar Creek, the commander of the 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac is Horatio Wright, who was the class of 1864 at Norwich. Commander of the 6th Corps, about 12,000 men by the time of the Battle of Cedar Creek. I think that it was the best corps in the Army of the Potomac, and of course the Vermont Brigade was the best brigade in the Army of the Potomac. But now the Shenandoah Valley fighting is a special case. Desperate times require desperate measures. By the early summer of 1864, Ulysses Grant had come east and located himself with the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac, which was commanded by George Gordon Meade. And starting on the 4th of May, 1864, the Army of the Potomac had driven 100 miles through Virginia in the Overland Campaign. 40 days of fighting that cost the previously United States of America 80,000 casualties in 40 days. The result was that Grant lays siege to Petersburg, Virginia, and really to the Confederate capital at Richmond. Petersburg was the railway center for Richmond. They had to hold Petersburg to be able to keep Richmond functioning as the capital. So Robert E. Lee, who liked to be on the move and out and launching surprise flank attacks and campaigns, was now bottled up in Petersburg and Richmond. But Lee was never one to just sit there and take it. Desperate times require desperate measures, and so in early July, he sends about 15,000 men under one of his best generals, Jubal Early, west from Petersburg into the Shenandoah Valley. And Early moves down the valley, which is north, and tries to capture Washington, D.C. Wow. A force of 6,000 men under General Lew Wallace meets Early's army along the Monocacy River near Frederick, Maryland, and in a one-day battle, that smaller army is defeated, but it slows Early's advance toward Washington by one day. When Early gets to Washington, within sight of the Capitol dome, he can see fresh troops making their way into the earthworks around Fort Stevens, and he knows his campaign has been defeated because his scouts tell him it's the Sixth Corps has just arrived from Petersburg. The Sixth Corps under Horatio Wright, including the Vermont Brigade. There's a day-long battle there, and then Early goes back into the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is vitally important to the Confederacy because Lee's armies are getting most of their food from the Shenandoah Valley along the Virginia Central Railroad. So, Ulysses Grant gives Phil Sheridan a 40,000-man army and tells him to go into the Shenandoah Valley and conquer it once and for all. Sheridan waits. He waits till mid-September. He's done nothing. Suddenly, a train pulls into Charlestown, Virginia, West Virginia now. Sheridan gets off the train. He meets Grant. Grant gives him hell. And 3 days later, Sheridan moves his 40,000-man army, and the first battle occurs at Winchester. A head-on collision between Jubal Early and Phil Sheridan. It lasts one day, and it's a standoff until the 8th Vermont Regiment under Stephen Thomas, and there he is right there. That's Thomas in later life, Stephen Thomas. He didn't enlist till he was 51, by the way. Thomas rides out in front of his men. He wants to get the battle line moving. He turns to his men and said, "Men, if you ever pray, pray now. Remember old Vermont and we'll drive them to hell. Come on, old Vermont." And the 8th moves forward, and then the 8th Corps is moving, and then the 19th Corps is moving, and then the 6th Corps is moving. And as General Sheridan says, Early went whirling through Winchester, and Early is defeated. Thank you, Stephen Thomas. 3 days later, Sheridan again victorious at Fisher's Hill. Now he follows Early's defeated army 50 miles south along the valley to Harrisonburg, turns and comes north, burning the valley, burning mills, burning farms, burning more than he should have burned, burning homes. Still in the Shenandoah Valley, they call it the burning. If you go down there with a Vermont license plate, watch out. I've been hollered at. Oh my goodness, they remember the burning. They come back along the valley. They cross Cedar Creek, which is a tributary of the North Fork of the Shenandoah, and Sheridan puts his army into camp on high ground, and Sheridan heads up to Washington to meet with his superiors, leaving Horatio Wright of Norwich in charge of his army. By now, it's about 33,000 men. Been heavy casualties. Well, Sheridan thinks that Early has really been trounced, but old Robert E. Lee sneaks him some reinforcements from Richmond, and Early has closely followed the withdrawal of the Union Army along the valley. And he sends some scouts to the top of that mountain right there. That's the Massanutten Mountain we're looking at up there in the left-hand corner. See if this pointer works. It's been advertised. Oh, look at that. Yes. Not just any scout, but he sends Jedediah Hotchkiss to the top of that mountain, who had been Stonewall Jackson's map maker, and he knew the terrain of the Shenandoah Valley better than anyone. Now, before Sheridan leaves for Washington, he has disposed his army in about a 6-mile long front, just to be sure, just to be careful. Jedediah Hotchkiss gets up on top of that mountain and he looks down at Sheridan's army and he sees a weak point. He sees that the Federal lines do not reach all the way to the banks of the Shenandoah River. He tells this to Jubal Early, and Early says, "That's where we will hit them." Well, this army needs a rest, and they're getting a good rest. It's beautiful autumn weather in the Shenandoah. One of the beautiful places in the world anyway. The Vermont soldiers said it reminded them of home. Night of October 18th, 1864. The officer in charge that night is Stephen Thomas. About midnight, he rides out in front of the lines to have a look around, and he gets shot at. He comes back and reports that event to the headquarters, General Wright's headquarters. Nobody seems too disturbed about it. In the meantime, Jubal Early is moving 7,000 men along the base of the Massanutten Mountain. And by the way, that is the northern tip of the Massanutten right there. It goes 50 miles south along the Shenandoah Valley, that mountain. It's a long ridge. Early has found an old pig track that leads along, and his men are marching single file without canteens, nothing that rattles, quietly, silently moving in the darkness along the base of that mountain. And before first light, they have waded across the Shenandoah River and have lined up in the fields along the river. And just before the sun rises, they attack from that direction, and they drive the Union Army. To slow the attack, Stephen Thomas and his small brigade, including the 8th Vermont Regiment, is sent to a hilltop right in the face of that 7,000-man onslaught. They make a stand for 10 minutes and lose 67% of their men in 10 minutes, the 7th highest regimental loss of any Union regiment in the entire war. They do manage to slow the attack, but on the Confederates come. Horatio Wright, early in the battle, now in command here, is shot in the face, but he keeps on fighting and he keeps giving directions, and the key direction that he gives is to get the 6th Corps involved in the battle, to line them up in a heavy battle line and fire a few volleys to slow this onslaught, and then he has a portion of the 6th Corps, including the Vermont Brigade, withdraw 3 miles north to a point where there is a curving ridge. And he puts 3 brigades up on that ridge, and in the center, of course, is the Vermont Brigade. And they prepare for the coming onslaught. Incidentally, you may want to look at this a little later on. This is a map I've long owned of Cedar Creek, which is signed by Sheridan, by Phil Sheridan. So, Early brings his army up and looks at these men up on the hill, about 6,000 of them, Vermont Brigade in the center, and he orders an attack, and the 6th Corps drives it back. A second attack comes, driven back. Incidentally, this fighting, all this fighting is happening, it's in, I always discover something new in this painting every time I look at it. It's amazing, it's so detailed. If you see where those puffs of smoke are, now this is of course later in the battle, and we'll talk about this, but on that ridge where those puffs of smoke are, That's Confederate cannon later in the battle. That's the ridge where the Vermonters and the Sixth Corps made their stand. I didn't realize it was in that painting until just a few weeks ago. It's there. So they drive off 2 Confederate attacks. Early brings up artillery, shells the ridge, and then he sends in one final heavy blow. Beside the Vermont Brigade is a New York Brigade under General Bidwell, who before the war had been the fire chief of Buffalo, New York. Men loved him. And in front of his men, he gets mortally wounded. Dies an agonizing death, and they're young soldiers, and they begin to retreat under the heavy pressure and the fright that this instilled in them. The second in command of Bidwell's brigade was Lieutenant Colonel Windsor French. He steps out in front of his men where the Vermonters could hear him and shouts what I think is the most clever command of the entire Civil War, calling on the difficult history between Vermont and New York, going back to the Revolution and before, all that fighting of Ethan Allen along the border and all that kind of thing, you know. Flatlanders, you know, New Yorkers. Windsor French hollers to his men so the Vermonters can hear, "Don't run, boys, until the Vermonters do." The New Yorkers come back up on the ridge, the Vermont line strengthens, and the attack is beaten off. The day is saved at Cedar Creek. Now the Vermont Brigade and its other 2 brigades withdraw another mile and begin to form a battle line on the north end of the battlefield. About 10 o'clock in the morning, Philip Sheridan arrives. He spent the night in Winchester, 12 miles to the north, mounted his Morgan, Rienzi, and galloped to the battlefield. The first troops he sees, the Vermont Brigade. He says, "What troops are these?" And Amasa Tracy, who's commanding the brigade, says, "We are the Vermont Brigade." And Sheridan says, "We'll have our camps by nightfall." Sheridan carefully lines up his men. Horatio Wright is here, badly wounded, but there he is right there. See him? This is a very detailed painting. There are many, many men in this painting who are you can identify, portraits painted into it. It's 3 o'clock when the battle line is well formed, and Sheridan lowers his sword, and the Army of the Valley moves forward, and they drive the Confederates a mile. Here you can see the Vermont Brigade going in. Here's that great counterattack. But the Confederate resistance stiffens. The Confederates have stopped the attack, and then something remarkable happens. The Confederates begin to feel the ground shake. They think it's an earthquake. No. It is the 4,000 hoofs of Custer's cavalry, including the 1st Vermont Cavalry, coming down from out of the northwest. See them right there, all lined up, sweeping down on the left flank of the Confederate line, and Cedar Creek becomes a rout. The Confederates are in full retreat. Many men are captured, and the Shenandoah Valley from that day forth is in Union hands, and Lee's army loses its breadbasket. Well, a great victory. 3 weeks later, Abraham Lincoln is reelected president. Certainly this victory had a major impact on the election. And of course, the war grinds on until April 2nd. The Sixth Corps under Horatio Wright, with the Vermonters at the front of the attack, breaks the Confederate lines at Petersburg, and a week later, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Wow. A lot of Norwich in that story. But we're not quite finished. A year after the Civil War, Norwich University has moved from its original location in Norwich, Vermont, down on the Connecticut River, just across the river from Dartmouth, and moved up to Northfield, where it is today, under Admiral Schneider. And Philip Sheridan is invited to Montpelier to speak at a veterans reunion. He's having a series of speeches through New England. He has some ideas of possibly running for president. He's accepting all of the speaking engagements he can get. He comes into Vermont at White River Junction on the train, and he comes up along the line through Bethel and Randolph, and every time he comes to a station, he stops briefly, and the crowds are out in masses. Sometimes he just waves, sometimes he says a few words. He stops at Northfield. And the university has just opened up down there, and the cadets march down to greet it at the railroad station, which still stands at the head of the green down there in Northfield. The cadets cheer him, and he's so impressed he changes his schedule and goes out and says a few words. Then he comes back, then he comes up to Montpelier. And they have a huge banquet. The legislature has a banquet for him, and the veterans are there. And it goes late into the night. And the toasts are frequent. Finally, about 11 o'clock, Sheridan whispers to his host, Speaker of the House, whose name was Stewart, that it's time for him to go. His special train is waiting. Well, Stewart has had a couple. And he decides that he's going to poke a little fun at Sheridan with his final toast. So he stands up and gives the toast saying this: "We salute the one-man reinforcement from Winchester." Now Sheridan stands up, all 5 feet 4 inches of him. Abraham Lincoln said he was so short he didn't have to bend over to scratch his knees. Sheridan stands up, and there's a long, dramatic pause. He holds his glass high, and with his words, I will end this story. He holds his glass high and says, "Better late than early." If you have questions, I'll take a few, although in my future is another one of these at 3 o'clock. Yes?
I know it doesn't look like it, but we're giving you a standing ovation right now. I know it doesn't look like it, but we're giving you a standing ovation right now.
I appreciate that greatly, yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
So is this a composition from memory, many memories, or is it a type of...
The artist, William Scott, first Medal of Honor winner from Vermont, went to the battlefield after the war, and so he paints the terrain absolutely perfectly accurately. I've been to Cedar Creek 50 times, led tours down there, and there's the Massanutten. You see that house to the left of the flag? That's an old mill that's still standing on the battlefield. The round hill is called Round Hill, and that rises just above Strasburg, Virginia, and that was General Sheridan's headquarters during the cavalry battle of Tom's Brook that preceded the Battle of Cedar Creek. Little North Mountain shows its end over there. Oh, it's a perfect depiction of the battlefield. And of course, Scott had been in the battles of the Peninsula Campaign, so he knew all about what battles look like. He interviewed a lot of the participants of the battle, and he had them into his studio, many of the veterans, to paint their portrait. This is, incidentally, a portrait that, on the left here. The large individual is a portrait of Lewis Addison Grant. who was the commander of the Vermont Brigade through most of the Civil War. Incidentally, his men had a nickname for him, Aunt Lydia. Lewis Addison Grant, known in the armies as the other Grant, of course. Aunt Lydia. Why did they call him Aunt Lydia? I wrote a book about the Vermont Brigade, and I couldn't find out. I knew he was a little bit fussy, and I knew he was a little bit of a stickler for regulations, you know, and that'll get men, you know. And then after the book came out one day, I was in an antique shop in Quechee, Vermont, and I saw up on the shelf an old box of Aunt Lydia's sewing materials. And on the cover of the box was a picture of Aunt Lydia, and she looked just like General Grant. Mystery solved. Yes?
Down here. It's interesting to note that of the 256 historic site markers in Vermont, you know, the green and the gold, you see them all over. There is only one that is not on Vermont soil. And you know where it is?
Yes, I spoke at its dedication. It's at Cedar Creek. It's at Cedar Creek. I want to put one over at Plattsburgh, the Battle of Plattsburgh, 1814, because the world doesn't know. You know, there was a great naval battle there. There also was a very interesting land battle over there, 4,000 Americans against 11,000 Britishers. Of those 4,000 Americans, 2,500 were Vermonters, more than there were New Yorkers. That needs to be said right there in the front of the New Yorkers. You see, Windsor French would understand that, you know. Don't run till the Vermonters do. One more question, or I'll just shut up right now. Thanks for listening.
Hey, thank you, Howard. Great.
Thank you.
Really wonderful.
I hope I made sense.
Oh, perfect.
Good.
No, I'm glad we got it recorded, too.
Hi, I'm Avram Patt. I'm the state representative from the Lamoille, Washington district. That includes Morrisville and Elmore in Lamoille County and Woodbury and Worcester in Washington County, and I'm from Worcester. This is my second term here, although not consecutive. I served in the 2015 and 16 session. I did not serve in the last session, and now I got elected again, so I'm back. One of the big pieces of work for me, and I knew this coming in, is that between this most recent election and the election before where I was not elected, more than half of the House members are new. And so a lot of what I'm working on is reading people's little name tags and figuring out who they are and where they come from, because there's a lot of people that I don't know that came in after I was here. And that includes committee chairs as well. 5 committee chairs chose not to run this time, so they had to be replaced by other people, including a number of people who came in at the same time that I did, and so that relatively quickly they've moved into committee chair positions. This term I'm on the Energy and Technology Committee. The energy part is very, very familiar to me, having been the general manager of Washington Electric Co-op for many, many years. And the technology, the broadband, cell phone, that stuff, I come into that probably knowing a little bit more than the average person, but not that much more. So that's the part where I'm learning. There's also an intersection that we're exploring between electric utilities and their infrastructure, and how we can best build out broadband in particular into the underserved and unserved areas, which in Washington Electric Co-op's case, most of the co-op's territory is underserved, including my house in Worcester. So that's what we've been working on. We've started putting out some broadband-related bills. I think we will get to putting out some energy-related bills a little bit later, but we wanted to get those out first. And it's interesting work, and in terms of the need and the pressure around the state for getting broadband out onto the back roads, that we hear that from all over the state. So it's a major concern. The question is how we pay for getting that done, because if people could make money doing that, it would have happened already.
Good afternoon. I'm Scott Beck, representative from St. Johnsbury. I'm here in the State House today. I'm on the House Ways and Means Committee, and we're looking at a lot of different things right now, but probably the two biggest are the Family Paid Medical Leave Bill, which would be a big change for Vermonters, upwards of $100 million in payroll taxes for a benefit for people that need to care for themselves or a loved one. That bill is in our committee. We'll spend a couple weeks with it, and then we'll see where it goes from there. The other thing that the House Ways and Means Committee is really spending a lot of time on is school education finance. Our districts are telling us what they're going to spend for the year, and that of course impacts property tax rates for all Vermonters, which is a big deal, and we're trying to figure out exactly what that impact is so we can give them as much information as possible before they go to town meeting here in a couple weeks. And other than that, like most Vermonters, we are enduring the longest winter that many can remember in this state and are looking forward to spring.
Hello, this is Andrew Perchlik. I'm Washington County's newest senator. I live in Montpelier, but for the prior 20 years I lived in Marshfield, Vermont. I'm on the Transportation Committee in this first year that I've been here in the Senate, and I'm working on a couple things that I think are of particular interest to folks in Washington County. One thing that I've been working on that I didn't think I was going to work on is emissions testing for vehicles. And Vermont just went over a change in how we test vehicles for safety and emissions. It was a big issue last year when I wasn't a senator, and the legislature made changes to make the safety part of the inspection a little easier. They got rid of some things that caused a failure for the test that really weren't safety related. So they got rid of those so you can pass the safety exam a little easier. But a lot of people were contacting me and others about problems with the emission side of the testing and the difficulties of really understanding what it meant, how to get it fixed, the cost of getting it fixed for an older car. And so I looked around at other states and talked to folks and proposed to my Transportation Committee that we make an exemption for older vehicles, because a lot of lower income Vermonters drive these older vehicles. They have difficulty keeping them on the road for the safety inspection because of rust. But I wanted to find relief for them so they didn't have to worry about the emissions testing, because often the emission testing isn't testing the emissions, it's testing the emission equipment. So the light will go on. I've heard a lot of stories of people where their mechanics just had no idea why the light was going on, had difficulties fixing it, or would fix one thing and that didn't work, fix another thing that didn't work, or they were being told it was going to cost $1,000 to get it fixed, and they didn't think, they wanted to put that, they didn't either have that kind of money or they didn't want to put that kind of money into that older vehicle, so they were kind of forced to get rid of their car. And you definitely really need a car in Vermont. So the Transportation Committee worked on a little bit, and we passed out a bill that would change it. So if your car was 11 years or older, you didn't have to do the emission testing. And this would provide this relief of the emission testing of about 120,000 to 130,000 vehicles. There's been an effort to maybe change that to 15 years, but that would lower the benefit to only like 5,000 or 10,000 Vermonters. So it's still something that's working on in the Senate, and I'm hoping to keep it to 10 years.